Welcome to the Zero Trust Journey podcast, created by cybersecurity practitioners for those walking the same path. We share real stories, hard lessons, and hard-won victories from the field, so you can sidestep the pitfalls and deliver the wins. Grab your coffee, tune out the buzzwords, and let's get into the real story right here on the Zero Trust Journey podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast episode around GRC, third-party risk management, and zero trust. I'm Tiernan O'Malley, and here with us is Rachel Curran, who is a GRC practitioner and also the founder of Locktivity. Thank you so much for being here, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me, Tiernan.
A great story. Rachel and I actually met at the ISSA Summit here in Los Angeles, and then we happened to run into each other this year at RSA in San Francisco. So very excited to...
That's literally.
Yeah. So very excited to continue bumping into each other. Yeah, would really love to hear about, I know you started Locktivity a few years ago, and would really love to hear about what you were kind of seeing that sparked that interest in moving into that space and where you were seeing things were kind of being overlooked.
Love to chat about that. So yeah, my background is I've worked for a little over a dozen years in the space around GRC and security, and kind of just found myself in that space because I work in startups where people needed to get things done and didn't know what to do. And so I figured it out. But in working in that space, I've helped a lot of companies go and build their SOC 2 programs or, get ready for being able to do ISO, get their security programs in place. And what I found in running third-party risk really internally is that even at small companies, it's really important. People are using a ton of third parties. We live in the age of cloud. That's not new. But what I saw was that this happens a lot in compliance and security, where we get compliance becomes a sort of checklist of things to do. And we don't always consider how it operationally affects the business and what the outcomes are that we're achieving beyond that we're getting through an audit. And I have always believed in trying to work with security in order to make sure that we're driving security. And then the outcome is that we are compliant. So I didn't see that path happening, and that was a little bit frustrating. And then when I think about third-party risk, it's a place that you can help change that is really one of the things that attracted me to it, because it's where the buyer talks to the customer purely around security. It's really, I shouldn't say purely. Third-party risk can be much broader, but from the cyber perspective, you really have this conversation and you can help drive. And then the other part of that, so that's kind of the opportunity to push change there, is that really when third parties are getting breached, and they're the biggest companies out there. We've seen in the news this year, not to sit and call people out, but you see Zscaler and Google and Salesloft and these companies that are big and spending money on security. And so I think there's a little bit of a fallacy that we'll go out and assess third parties and figure out which one will get breached. And we just avoid breaches. We're doing a survey right now, over 80% of the respondents have said that they've had a third party breach in the last year or more than one. What's important though, is that fewer respondents say they were impacted. And that's the thing that we're trying to help companies focus on, is that you have all these third parties, they might get breached. Instead of trying to assess them to a point of feeling secure, it's about what you're doing with them. And that's where I see the gap. So I know I've said a lot there, but that's where I see the gap. And that's where we really want to help companies understand where the real risk lies. When those companies get breached, does it impact them, and what can they do proactively to help limit that impact?
Right. And we see a lot of companies and they're doing their due diligence internally, but once you get to the perimeter, if you leave it all open, then there's no point in even doing that. It's all been kind of revoked, your boundary of security. Out of curiosity, rather than at Framework Security, we do SOC 2 compliance. We go through these kind of assessments. But what that really is kind of a screenshot in time of how operations are being done. It is not dynamic. It's not continuous, which is really, I think people they don't take it as much with a grain of salt, and they assume that assessment remains true throughout the entire year, which is completely invalid. So with this continuous monitoring, what does that look like versus a one-off?
I'm curious when you mentioned this, because obviously the work that you guys do at Framework is around helping companies you're on the side of the trust. I need to build trust with my customer, right? And so you're self-assessing, you're creating reports. I will say I'm not as anti the kind of point in time audit as I think a lot of people are. And I'll tell you why. It does matter. It doesn't mean that 6 months in, everything's perfect. But for one, I don't think it means everything's perfect the day it's done. And two, a lot of the core controls, I actually don't believe are so likely to change. Sure, Some people didn't do their security awareness training. We all know that's happening in the middle, right? They didn't do it on time. We adjust dates. Even that, like the audit may never come up with it. But did encryption get turned off? Probably not, right? If we found that the first time, that's a configuration. It's pretty weird for somebody to spit out. Mistakes happen. And so I think one of the things that those audits aren't going to check, I'll give it an example, like the Snowflake accounts. This one is a great example of why I think it's about what we do with our third parties. But a lot of companies didn't have 2FA enabled on their Snowflake accounts. If anyone's not familiar, Snowflake stores a lot of data for people. People had their accounts hacked, a lot of data got breached. But it wasn't Snowflake per se, and nobody was getting into production behind the scenes. It was the customers and their instance. I don't think when you do those audits, those customers who had their accounts hacked, you would have learned they didn't have 2FA because it's often kind of out of scope or not something that gets checked. So that's where I don't know that I'm so anti that. But I think continuous monitoring is actually understanding what's happening in our environments because it's so rapidly changing. Our kind of, like I said, the hard controls around like encryption don't tend to change, but we're bringing in new third parties. We're forgetting to enable SSO or 2FA. We're forgetting that there's data flowing to places it's not supposed to go. We're giving people access to integrate tools. And sometimes we don't really know. I mean, most people I talk to, even when people say, yeah, we know our population of vendors, when you get in there and really start to look, like if you ask that question, often you get, yes, I know my inventory. I don't need help. When you start to say, okay, give me that inventory, that falls apart. And I think that's something that people just don't really know. So to me, the continuous monitor is a little bit more on the internal side. And then knowing when big changes happen with that vendor, leadership changes, if they have a breach, those are things you need to know about. But it's more major events than knowing every single control every day. My 2 cents. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. And yes, I think it's that lack of visibility. I mean, as you mentioned, you can go in and you can say, and people tend to believe that they understand their vendor landscape. And it's like, okay, we went through the questionnaire, they have this certification, and it's much deeper than that. And as you mentioned, once you kind of start mapping it out, it's like, okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you're going to leaders, sometimes this is a challenge to kind of explain what this kind of proactive rather than reactive kind of way of trying to secure and bring in processes and operations that are secure or bettered. When trying to speak with leaders who are not in the security space, that can become challenging because it seems almost like it's really challenging to put it into a quantifiable discussion, I've found. So I'm curious what metrics you've found that actually translate or resonate to the risk or kind of the core business part of things.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that is hard. I think generally for security, like not just third-party risk, but generally, one thing that I find is that there's a lot of focus on quantifying risk and there's value in speaking in dollars to leadership, right? So there's absolutely value in that. And you'll see budgets come when you can say, hey, here's the likelihood of us being breached because we've got so many third parties. And we know that, the likelihood that one of these gets breached this year is, very high. We have a 1 in 3 chance of getting breached every year. It goes up. So that does really help. But I also think it's understanding what they care about. So it's not always the same metric. It's understanding what does that leader care about? Is it their reputation? If they get breached for them, is it that they just care that they get breached? Is it the leader who says, I don't really care if we get breached, not say, but that's the truth. That happens sometimes, that it's not my reputation or that we do, it's how much is this going to cost me? Right. And so I think just understanding what their priority is one of the biggest things that you can do, but also enlightening them to, you can use the facts of what's happening in the world. And that's part of how we do quantify what's the likelihood of you being breached based on comparing what's happening within your industry. But I think a lot of times they don't understand how frequent these things are. It feels kind of, they're separated from it. They say, hey, don't we have a contract? No, actually, the contract will get us. Maybe we pay this company. There are companies that you pay them $5,000 and they have access to your email, right? If that gets hacked, that can have huge damages. And it might be they have 12 months that you've paid them as a subscription fee, right? That is the total liability. So now you've got this misunderstanding sometimes around what that cost could be to us and what protections we have. I think a lot of it's just education, but it does really help. Dollar amounts always do help if you can pull that together. But also, again, speaking their language about what it is they really care about. If it's the customer data, if it's their own inbox, sometimes it's making it very personal. And this is true with employees too, not just leaders. I think understanding it's just more relatable. It's not that they don't care about other people, but it's more relatable when you can show how you might get into their information. I think there was a CEO who, through all the like agentic AI integrations, I can't remember who it was, but found out that their pay history and tax history have been available to their entire company because through the agentic AI integrations, anybody could go use this tool. It had access into their data store. So those types of things, I don't know if people had looked at it, but that was very personal and very concerning. And if you said, hey, people might get to the wrong files, well, so it's not always that dollar, but just, telling the real story.
Yeah. And we've seen so many examples lately that have been highly publicized and highly visible, either organizations or individuals, which is unfortunate, though I think it provides a great learning experience, especially if we can backtrack, and kind of see how it escalated, what happened, where there was lack of segmentation, whatever it was. So yeah, I think that actually absolutely helps our case when it comes to oh, it won't happen to me. Everything's fine so far. It's going to be fine. I know where everything is. I know where all my vendors sit. And it's like, well, so they.
Yeah, well, and AI is changing this, right? Because you think about it, I mean, it's not only AI, but it makes it better that this data that is not necessarily structured is easier to query now, right? And so it hasn't always only been this, but as one of those examples, we did a talk that was on lateral movement attacks and talking about breaking down the sales loft one. And this isn't to call them out. This could be anyone in the world, frankly. I mean, any company, these things, we all have weaknesses. But it was them getting in through maybe a laptop, maybe through missing 2FA, we're not totally sure, but getting into somebody's account into GitHub. And then they're able to find secrets. And there's a lot of things that we forget that's a lot of security is about hygiene from my perspective. So for example, like you might find secrets in code and you delete them, but you forget that it's in your history of commits, in your commit history. So they can get to those secrets and they'll discover them because you can query across the environment. You don't have to say, show me secrets, right? Mm-hmm. Then you get into, they can hop with those into other accounts. And so this is where the third party risk really, this is where I say, like, how are we using these third parties? This is where the risk lies, is that this cloud of different third parties are, I mean, they're in the cloud, but they're literally their kind of own cloud around you. And there's so much data available that we sometimes just kind of overlook because it's not where we store this stuff. But there are also secrets in that case in Salesforce, not where you're supposed to keep them, right? That led to them getting into Google accounts. So there's all these places. And so our environments are just much more exposed than they used to be. And so a big part of this is your footprint. We try to focus on making sure people do know what's there because that's what matters. But that's why I think this matters so much and thinking about it from that perspective.
Yeah. And you mentioned hygiene being one of kind of the key things is lack of visibility or monitoring or just knowing where your data is. What would you say are kind of other more key attack paths that could be used once a vendor is onboarded and maybe not and is kind of left with free access and kind of has become a permanent part of the infrastructure, I suppose, and is forgotten? Where else would you say are kind of the most commonly seen levels of overgiven trust, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we see out there. So one of them is that when a vendor, and this is historical, I mean, the Target breach is a great example, right? Which is it's got to be 15 years ago or something more now. But that once a vendor gets assessed, this is where we treat this as a trust exercise, right? So when we talk about the zero trust, coming back to that, third-party risk has been treated as a trust exercise. Let me go see, are you good? Do we trust you? Come on in. And now you're in and it's like, go for it. And so we see, and a lot of that has to do with silos internally. It may not be the policy, but it's that the person who approved and then the person who can grant access aren't always talking. So in that case, HVAC vendor was granted access to a network that really made them not low risk and bad things happen. But I think that's one thing is that still exists a lot in our environments is that once they're in, because it's the business owners out there that are trying to achieve some goal and this tool will help them do it and this tool's in their ecosystem and cool, they go do it. It's not anyone trying to be bad. It's just people trying to get stuff done. So I'd say that one, knowing what we're using and how we're using it. Another one is that we don't set up the right authentication methods. So we're not hardening our environment. So it might be that I've seen actually MSPs tell me like, 2FA SSO is enforced. And you're like, no, it's enabled, but everyone can log in with their passwords. That's not enforced. that still puts us at risk with passwords, right? I think sometimes we overlook that, and that's a huge one. That was in 2024, like almost 1 billion records were leaked because of the fact that there wasn't 2FA on like support and CRM tools. So that is just such a simple, that goes to hygiene, but it's such a big deal. And then I'd say another one that like people overlook sometimes is that OAuth tokens don't always disappear because the user does. So they inherit the user's permissions, but when it's used to enable an integration, sometimes it breaks when the user goes away, sometimes they exist. And so those are things to pay attention to, because those OAuth tokens, I guess 2 parts to those. That's, if you don't know, that's when you integrate 2 tools, often it uses OAuth to grant permissions. And there's 2 things that happen. One, they get left in stale and you're not using it, but this path is still open. It's kind of like leaving the front door open when you go on vacation, right? Like you're not paying attention. But then the other one is that these OAuth tokens have full permission. So it's like, instead of bringing them in and, maybe they just need to drop a package in the front door, they can actually get through everything in the house, right? And so what we really should be doing is looking at our third parties. One of the things I would definitely encourage asking and then also monitoring is, how are those things being configured? Are their integrations least privileged to what they're trying to accomplish? That's how we should all be building, I think, at this point. But definitely something to check before, especially with agentic AI, where like AI could be prompted to end up going and doing something else with that token than what you intended. So I think those are a few that I would say are really important to pay attention to.
Yeah. And I think we definitely see more of that hygiene done internally. With employees, we hammer down on it. It's the authentication, authorization. It's the removing a user immediately as soon as they're dismissed from the organization. And again, if we're not doing that with our third party kind of channel there, then there's, it all kind of goes out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then a final question. What are some warning signs that vendor risk will increase before there's an incident?
So I'm going to say this is rather, no, that's okay. I'm going to say this is a little bit subjective, but I have noticed that some of the companies that end up getting breached, now I want to caveat, sometimes you just can't know. I actually just believe you just cannot know. And it's because of the fact that it just takes that one person who gets phished and that one missing control somewhere on some account, right? There's a lot of fraudulent activity happening out there. It's so easy for bad actors they're in our hair all the time. So I think that's important. And I just want to throw that out. But I have noticed that sometimes when vendors are less forthcoming about their security, there's a good sign. And I have seen that have effect where I've recognized I'm not getting answers. I'm not getting the clarity of response. And they're almost trying to gate you from getting to information about their security. And I've seen them be major breaches that many millions of people have experienced. So that's one thing. Another one would be sometimes changes. But when there are acquisitions and mergers, knowing how those are being handled, because when you have a whole lot of different systems, just the reality is you're trying to merge and manage a lot of different changes happening really fast. So I'd just be in touch with vendors to make sure that they're staying on top of things. And then obviously, if we know that there are a lot of vulnerabilities that aren't being mitigated, that's always, vulnerabilities are a pathway. But those might be 3 that I would throw out. Sorry to anyone going through mergers and acquisitions, but there's a lot of change that happens there. And it's certainly a time to check in with your vendor. I'll say that. Doesn't mean they will get breached, but just make sure it's happening.
And that's great advice. Yeah. Thank you.
I was curious, one thing we kind of touched on, but in terms of the trust factor with your customers, are you seeing that when people are assessing third parties that there's this concern? You mentioned kind of the point in time thing, but I think there's also that there are these very, I'll say, cheap audits happening where maybe there's some confidence loss in some of the audit reports that are out there. And I still see people absolutely looking to them. To be fair, while there's a lot of talking about this kind of distrust, I see a lot of people looking to them. But are you seeing your customers make any decisions, use any certain frameworks, or are they doing anything to try to garner that trust or ensure that their customers have that trust from the audit reports that they're producing? Do you see any changes happening in that space?
Yeah. And I think that kind of comes back to what you were mentioning earlier, where a lot of it is really about, it's an educational process. So we have to know that these assessments, these letters of attestation, these auditors, and many auditors have different styles, they have different backgrounds. Not to dismiss any of them, but to know that this was done, none of them will be the same, and this was done at a point in time. So it's not so saying this is a stamp of approval for everything. It's more so saying you're looking at a specific question that you are trying to make a decision based on, and you're trying to measure the level of risk with it. So if it's a certain decision and you go into that assessment report and you find what specifically they were looking at and you find the details around it, you can kind of use that to assist in your decision making, though it's not the make or break. It's not a yes or no switch. It's more to assist in contributing to, okay, what level of risk does this have? Are we willing to take it? Does it need to change? So I think it is a tool that helps you kind of prioritize your risk, but it is not an end all be all. It is not the final stamp. It is not a complete safeguard whatsoever.
I actually just put something up on LinkedIn to ask people how they're looking at these to get kind of a true, what I see is what you're kind of describing is that it is one piece. Sometimes it's a big piece of what our customers are looking at, and sometimes it's a smaller piece, but it tends not to be the only thing they're looking at about their vendors. And sometimes it's a lot more. But two things I want to throw out. One, that question about what other times things that might see breaches coming, layoffs is something to pay attention to when there's a lot of layoffs. That's another one. Just because the people who are in the know leave, things shake up. There may be some people who are upset internally. There's a lot of reasons to look at that as well. But a couple of things I want to throw out, we talked about this a little bit with the Assure model, and that is a model we've come out with, and I'm curious to just want to throw it out to people that you can look. It's called Fixing the ROI of Vendor Due Diligence. But what we're proposing is an idea, and the goal of this is solely to come up with an idea to raise that minimum bar on these types of audit reports and say, hey, let's actually validate that you have those critical controls in place and take a threat-based approach. I think this is also something that is changing in third-party risk, is to say, what are the things that are happening? So when I talked about the 2FA and a bunch of records leaked, right? That is really what's happening. It's social engineering. It's breaking through authentication in some way. So strong authentication that your vendors have this is important. I think the idea is that we get greater evidence and confidence in those greatest threats, or the controls that help fight those greatest threats. Definitely, if anybody wants to talk about that or wants to check it out, I recommend it. But love to get feedback, and you're trying to help the industry move in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to kind of follow up with that too, is if anyone wants to reach out and learn more about Locktivity or just speak with you in general and connect, how would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, go to our website, locktivity.com, spelled like it sounds, LOCKTIVITY. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, and that's a great way, and reach out. I will reply. So that I'm Rachel Curran again, and on LinkedIn. So yeah, I would say one of those two. And thank you so much, Tiernan, for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And it's fun to see you again. We'll have to just keep bumping into each other.
This has been great. We'll have to bump into each other again soon. And thank you so much.
Sounds good.
Have a great rest of your day.
That's a wrap on this Zero Trust journey. Now it's your turn. Step into the spotlight, share your story, and be part of the journey. Subscribe to Zero Trust Journey on LinkedIn for the latest news, events, and giveaways. Until next time.